And welcome here again to the penultimate video in this series of GCSE revision videos hosted by me, Ben from allsociology. Today what we're doing is our last one on education, and specifically what we're going to be looking at today is differences in achievement according to different groups in society. So hopefully now I'm up in my little corner, up in my little perch there where I belong, and you can see on the screen there we've got sociology, educational achievement. I'm going to take that away very quickly to talk about what we're doing today is about internal and external factors that can affect achievement. So I'm talking about stuff that happens in school internally, or external factors, stuff that happens outside of school. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about issues relating to class. So why is it that generally middle class kids do better in school than working class kids? I'm then going to have a look at ethnicity and talk about why it is that certain ethnic groups do better in education than others. And then finally looking at the difference between genders and asking really why is it that girls do better than boys in exams. Now you may have seen this earlier already, but just to remind you, what we mean by achievement is basically getting good exam results. And the measure that is generally used by people is getting 5 or at least 5 what used to be A star to C, which is now 9 to 4 GCSEs. So you need to get 5 GCSEs at least of a grade 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, and that's what we mean by educational achievement. Now, the other thing to mention just really quickly is sometimes the exam board will use the phrase attainment. Attainment, achievement, basically the same thing. All right, so let's have a bit of a look then at some of these internal factors that are affecting educational achievement. Now, the thing I'm going to say to you right away before we even get into this is if you want a good breakdown on these factors, these internal processes that happen in schools that affect achievement, go back and watch the previous video, which is number 8, and it looks literally at processes in school that affect achievement. So in that video, I talk about things like labeling and the self-fulfilling prophecy, tying that to the work of Howard Beckett and David Hargreaves. We look at the role of the organisation of teaching and learning in schools. So for instance, talking about how certain subjects might be set. So like maths, you might have top set, bottom set, and anything in between. And in other schools, what they do is they do a process called banding or streaming, which is where you're not just in certain subject groups for how high you achieve in those groups, you're actually in ability groups for every single subject you do. And the sociologists we associate that with are Stephen Ball and Nell Keddy. We can also look at the formation of subcultures within school. Now, particularly we're interested in anti-school subcultures, those groups who might form in school and then have a value consensus that goes against that of the wider school. So they might resist, as Willis found, some of the values of school and instead have their own value system. We can also look at the role of the hidden curriculum as well. So this is everything that you learn in lessons everything you learn in school that isn't in lessons. And when we look at the hidden curriculum, both functionalists and Marxists have different views, as do feminists. Marxists and feminists see the hidden curriculum as having a negative effect in socializing us, whereas functionalists argue that the hidden curriculum actually prepares us for school. I've just realized what I haven't done. I'm going to get a little bit brighter because I haven't turned my light on. Whoa, that's super bright. Oh, I don't know if I want that. Do I want that? Yeah, let's keep it. Why not? And so we've got the hidden curriculum there that can affect. Also thinking about, and I haven't talked much about this yet, is about the type of school that someone might attend, whether it's a state school run and funded by the government, or whether it's an independent school, so a private school or a public school. And then the final thing that's really kind of related more to feminism than anything else is the way in which certain subjects can be gendered. So by that, what we mean is that certain subjects are more appealing or seem to be more appropriate for boys or girls. And the classic example I always do is I split technology or design and technology into those traditionally masculine subjects like engineering, resistant materials, metalwork, woodwork, those kind of things, and the traditionally feminine subjects like food technology and textiles. Okay, so there's just a bit of a basic background on internal factors affecting achievement. But as I say, go back to the previous lesson, or the previous video, should I say, which is number 8, where I go through all of that stuff in a lot more detail. Now, in addition to stuff that happens in school, there is a range of factors or processes that can happen outside of school, like for instance in your family home, that can also affect your achievement at school. And what we're going to do is we're going to break these down into 2 different sets. We're going to look at, first of all, what we call material factors. And material factors are basically anything you can touch or anything that's to do with money. Okay, so if you can touch it, it will be material. If you can't, it will be something called cultural. But let's deal with the material in the first place. Now, if you don't have some of these things, like you've got their income, a good job, if you are perhaps living in poverty, perhaps if you don't have access to resources, perhaps if your housing is damp or it's cramped, or perhaps you don't have a good level of nutrition, diet and health, you might be argued to be suffering from material deprivation, i.e. you don't have these things. Deprivation of deprived means you don't have something. Material is stuff you can touch, and money, so you don't have the stuff that's related to money that you can buy to help you through your education. Now, the income, occupation and poverty thing, that's kind of like self-explanatory, but I imagine when we think about like access to resources, what we're thinking here is do you or does your family have the ability to provide you with things like your own copy of a textbook, your own revision guide, your own computer to do work from home? Maybe have they got the money to provide you with a personal tutor? These kind of things. If you don't, that could be an argument for material deprivation, and one of the reasons why working class kids don't do as well in school. But this is not just about class, it extends to gender, extends to ethnicity as well. When it comes to your type of housing you have, I'm not going to talk too much about like the area in which your house is, but that will also have an effect. But think about the actual quality of the housing itself. So if your house is damp, and lots of people don't know what damp is, because luckily you haven't lived in a house with damp. I've lived in several, and it's not very nice. Basically what damp is, it's like a mold that kind of grows on the walls, and often you can see it, sometimes you can't. But obviously, basically, mold growing in your house is not going to be good for your health. If you're breathing that in, so if it's in your bedroom, for instance, that's going to make you sick. When you get sick, you're going to have to take days off school. When you take days off school, you're going to miss lessons. When you miss lessons, you miss learning, and therefore you might be likely to underachieve. Okay, so I've just made that argument there with damp housing. Now, the other thing we can talk about here is cramped housing. So if you do not have your own space or quiet space and a nice desk and things to do your work, you might argue that your housing is cramped. Perhaps you share a bedroom or a study space with a sibling. If you don't have your own space to do things, it's going to be much harder for you to do it, and therefore could affect your learning and therefore your achievement. And then when it comes to diet and health, what we mean by this is do you have, or does the child or their family have the material ability to provide them with nutritious meals, diet, and those kind of things? Because what we're talking about here is really the idea that like good nutritious food will give you energy, it will help your brain, it will help you concentrate throughout the day. Now, if you are eating your 5 fruit and veg or whatever, however many it is we're supposed to eat these days, then that's awesome, because that's going to help you. But these things are quite expensive. And so what we might argue is that people or pupils who don't get access to those good quality nutritious meals, and perhaps are living off takeaways or foods that are high in salt and high in sugar, they're going to lead to a lack of concentration, a lack of energy, and that could therefore mean that you miss things in lessons and your learning doesn't get extended as far as someone whose brain's really in gear with those kind of key nutritional foods that's going to keep that person concentrating throughout the lesson. Okay, so there we go. We've got some material factors there. Remember, all things you can touch. Now, these are cultural factors. These are things you can't touch. Okay, so that's the big difference. Material, you can touch it. Cultural, you can't. And when we say someone who perhaps is lacking these things, we would use the same kind of phrase, but instead of talking about material deprivation, we'd argue it is cultural deprivation. Now, I really don't like this word because it comes across that certain types of cultures or ways of living life are superior or inferior to others. So I personally don't like it, but we'll use it anyway because it's in the textbook. So thinking about groups who might not have let's rephrase that, who may have experienced cultural deprivation. Look at the work of Bourdieu. So go back to when I discussed the theories on education and also the processes, so lessons or videos 7 and 8. Bourdieu talks about this concept called cultural capital, which is basically the knowledge, the values, the ideas, and the experiences that you have that can help you to get on and get further in life. Okay, and what Bourdieu argues is middle class people have this, working class people don't, and because schools are middle class institutions, you've got a nice mix of middle class cultural capital mixing with schools, whereas you've got the working class that doesn't quite fit very well. And so basically what Bourdieu is arguing is that middle class kids are better equipped to deal and negotiate their way through a school, through their school career, that kind of thing. Then we've got the ideas here about language, and what Basil Bernstein, I love his name, Basil Bernstein, what he says with this basically is in working class homes, they use a different type of language and speaking to what they would use in middle class homes. So Bernstein refers to middle class homes as using elaborate language or elaborate speech. So what he means by that is well articulated, long words, people describing things in detail. whereas the working class have what he calls a restricted code, which is quite the opposite. So it's quite short sentences, short monosyllabic words, and not an awful lot of kind of like linguistic technique going on in that language. Now, what Bernstein basically says is because schools operate on this elaborate code system where they talk in this kind of language and they write in this language, if you're at home and you're getting that kind of experience and that exposure to those kind of elaborate language codes, then you're going to do better at school because of it. Meanwhile, the working class who only have a restricted code it doesn't quite match with the values of the school, and so you're not going to get on as well as you would do if you use the elaborate code. And then the last thing here we've just got is and I think this is particularly interesting, and I suppose there's a whole bunch of sociologists you could associate with this with. I think Young is probably the best one. So Young, 1967, talks basically about the ways in which parents' experiences and their values and their own kind of expectations about school will have a knock-on effect on their children. So if your parents have had a good experience at school, perhaps they've gone onto college or sixth form, even university, those values, those experiences are going to be passed on to you. Meanwhile, if your parents don't have that, the argument goes is that they might not value education as much, and so that value isn't passed on to you, or it is, but it's shown as not very important, for instance. And again, we're thinking about things like aspiration. So how much are your parents kind of, not pushing you, but saying, this is what you could do. These are the various options available to you. And the argument from people like Young would be that working class families just don't have those experiences and therefore don't have those aspirations to kind of channel their sons and daughters through. So there we've got some external factors there that relate to material things. So anything that happens outside of school, material things you can touch and to do with money, and cultural are basically like ideas and experiences and values that we have, okay? So those are a whole bunch of things that might affect someone's educational achievement at school. Now, I'm going to make reference to these and those internal factors because we're now going to have a look at social class. And effectively, in a nutshell, what do we mean, and why is there a difference between pupils achieving well from the middle class and perhaps pupils not achieving as well from the working class? It's because there is massive differences, and we can explain these through reference to those internal and external factors. That's why I started the video off by looking at those internal factors and external factors, because we're now going to apply some of those ideas and explain why they might result in class differences in education. Now, the other thing we're going to say as well is that on the whole, we focus in terms of state schools in this, so don't worry too much about kids who go to public schools versus kids who go to state schools. Just think about what happens in state schools itself. So what can we say about this, and why are there class differences? There are loads of things you can say. So looking at the internal stuff, so what happens in school, we can talk about the role of labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy. Becker and Hargreaves both actually say there are links between the way teachers label pupils. So in case of Becker, it's the ideal pupil. And these are very closely linked to class. So Becker even said that the middle class pupils are most closely embodying that idea of what an ideal pupil is, and working class kids are furthest away. Now, when I explained a little bit about labeling and how it can work, I think that was in video 7, go back and have a watch of it, you'll understand a little bit that can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you're told constantly you're going to fail, you are going to start believing that. Meanwhile, if you're told constantly you're going to succeed and do very well, you are going to start believing that, and it's going to come true. In terms of banding and setting, we've got disproportionate amounts of working class kids in lower bands and lower sets, and Ball would argue that that is a key reason why working class kids don't do as well. We can also look at the work of Paul Willis and his ideas about working class kids resisting school values and creating their subcultures, and so anti-school subcultures. And this is tending to be something, not exclusively, but tends to be something that is more to do with working class pupils having different values against those in the school, and so those groups will value those particular things that they've decided are important. So whether it's mucking about, having a laugh, I don't know, throwing prick sticks onto the roof, or whatever it might be, those are the things that they value. And then also we can consider school type as well. So there's clear differences, aren't there, between the level of education that you get at a private school or a public school versus as opposed to a state school as well. Now, when it comes to external factors, we are going to talk about material deprivation and cultural deprivation. It doesn't really matter what ones you focus on, but I think there is things that can be said from both sides of that coin outside of that. So let's just think materially. Perhaps working class pupils don't have the money and resources to afford things like textbooks, access to a tutor, their own internet access, their own computer, those kind of things, and that's going to lead them to underperforming in school. By taking the cultural argument, let's go for something like parental values. So using the ideas of Young, he would say that working class kids don't have that kind of aspirational ideas because their parents haven't had them for them, so they haven't passed those values on to them. Meanwhile, the middle class parents who've been to sixth form, college and uni can explain all about the wonders of those things to their children and really put the idea into their heads that that's something that they should be aspiring to do. So I just thought I could make some like theory links with this as well, because one of the things we can say when it comes to class is that Marxists are always going to have something to say, and they would always argue that the education system is rigged in favour of the ruling class, and you can use any of those certainly those internal arguments to suggest that Marxists were correct in their assumption. By the way, Willis himself was a Marxist, so you can bring him in quite easily there. We can also talk about the role that Marxists say that the education system performs in, that it's not fair and it's not meritocratic. So they talk about the myth of meritocracy. But one of the things I wanted to kind of highlight to you guys, first of all, or last of all, should I say, is that not all sociologists who research class are Marxists. So the only one up there I've mentioned who is a Marxist is Paul Willis. Okay, so don't just assume that they're all Marxists because they mention class. Most of these people, particularly if we're looking at the processes in school, so Becker, Hargreaves, Ball, they're interactionists. Okay, they look at the small scale detail between two people interacting. So let's have a look at some of the ethnic differences. And by this, what we mean by ethnicity is different cultural groups. And we often think about these in terms of race, but race isn't the only factor that we come to think about when we consider ethnicity. So we're thinking about things like language, nationality, country of origin, your race, of course, your cultural traditions, all of these kind of things. And what we're going to say basically is there are massive differences between ethnic groups in terms of their achievements. So how the extent to which they will get 9 to 4 GCSEs. Now, very generally speaking, Chinese and Indian pupils perform very well in exams and tend to be at the top, whereas Black, working class, white and Roma Gypsy pupils tend to do quite poorly in those exams and in terms of achievement. So how many of those actually get those 5 A-star to Cs or 9 to 4 GCSEs? And once again, what we can do is we can make reference to why this is through internal and external factors. Now, there are loads and loads of overlaps between class and ethnicity, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but there are also some specific things that you can talk about when it comes to why there are differences between ethnic groups in education. So if we look at the internal processes, so what happens in school, we can think about the role of labeling and racism individually by teachers towards students. So maybe you might have racist teachers who are just going to decide that they are going to label non-white kids, for example, as troublemakers, as unruly, as disruptive and whatever. And that's going to have a big effect. Now, one of the things we can see with this is that Black Caribbean students are far more likely to be excluded than white kids, and they're far more likely to be put in for special educational needs than white kids as well. And the other thing as well is they're more likely to be entered for lower papers. So that might argue something towards that. But aside from the individual racism, one of the big arguments about why certain ethnic minorities don't do as well in education is because of institutional racism. Now, this is not where just one person is racist. It's where the whole entire institution, the systems, the processes, the ground in which it's built on are effectively racist. And one of the arguments that you can use to apply to this institutional racism idea is that of an ethnocentric curriculum. So ethnocentric means something only focuses on one cultural or ethnic group. And what the argument goes is that in Britain, our national curriculum or our formal curriculum tends to focus on white, British or maybe European history, literature, art, etc. And the argument goes that this can alienate Black minority ethnic students from that because they don't see the value of it in relation to who they are. So there was a big hoo-ha a few years ago when Michael Gove, then the Education Secretary, argued that he wanted a British literature curriculum. And so that's why, if you are taking GCSEs now, you will probably only be studying British texts in your English literature lessons, okay? So that's a good example of the ethnocentric curriculum. By the way, if you want a theorist to attach to the idea of institutional racism, go for Gilbourne, okay? So David Gilbourne says literally schools are institutionally racist. Now, when we think about the external factors, now this is where it becomes really interesting, because a lot of those factors that we looked at relating to class will also apply to ethnicity. And that's because there is a real connection, I suppose, between levels of poverty and lower social class and ethnic minorities. Basically, if you're non-white, you tend to be lower social class. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's the general rule of thumb. But the other thing we can talk about with this is like, and this of course isn't every single non-white kid, but like in terms of language, many of these pupils may not be speaking English as their first language. So EAL means English as an additional language. And what this basically means is that these kids are going to struggle even more than kids for whom English is their first language, because they've got to get their head around what the teachers are saying and what they're trying to communicate to them in lessons, even before they can think about what the actual content of what it is they're learning about. Okay. And so we've got there just a whole bunch of internal and external factors. We can also include parental values in this as well. So one of the reasons why it's argued that Chinese pupils do so well is because their parents have a value of hard work. They have a hard work ethic at home. And so often it's traditional for Chinese students to do some work before school and do some work after school. Whereas I know from where my background as a student, that didn't happen with me. So there's some arguments there that look at internal and external reasons why there are differences between ethnic groups in education. But I'm just going to highlight some of these overlaps as well. So these are sorts of things you could talk about if you get a question on why there are ethnic differences in education. And these are the links between class. So labeling, we talked about briefly already. Anti-school subculture. So Tony Sewell did a study on black lads forming anti-school subcultures. I told you already about the banding and setting. So I believe it's something like, oh gosh, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like 2 in 3 black kids are entered for lower papers, and I think only 1 in 3 white kids. Is it something like that? Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. And I believe if you've got the GCSE textbook, the EduCast black one with an umbrella on the front of it, you can look that up. There's a statistic in there somewhere. The other thing we can talk about, of course, is these, as I've mentioned all the way through this, most of these class factors externally can be applied to ethnicity. So if you get a question on class and ethnicity, effectively, you can use a lot of the same arguments. You're just going to need to apply them in a slightly different way. But please don't forget some of these specific things like institutional racism, the language used at home, and some of the racism that might happen within schools. So let's have a look at gender as well. And now there are also big differences between girls and boys in terms of getting those good GCSEs. So if we look at the statistics, girls have consistently outperformed boys in almost every subject for about 30 years now. So about 3/4 of girls get those good 5 A star to C or 9 to 4 GCSEs, whereas only about 60% of boys, no, that's terrible, about 66% of boys do. So you've got a huge more amount of girls getting this than boys. And again, how are we going to explain these differences? Internal and external factors. So there are some specific factors that are associated with gender. And I've mentioned some of these already in previous videos. So things about like gendered subjects. We can talk about one of the reasons why girls do particularly well at school now is because we've got this concept of a feminization of schools, which is basically where schools have become female places. Lots and lots of female teachers. I believe it's something like 2/3 of teachers are female. And so that might provide girls with positive role models, perhaps. We've also got the ideas about labeling. So perhaps girls are labeled as bright and perhaps boys are labeled as not so bright. These things do happen as well. Now, some of the more interesting stuff goes to look at the external factors. So why is it that girls have got so much better than boys? And we can look at some of those external factors, like the classic one would be the changing role of women in society. So the idea that women now have the opportunity to go out, get educated and get jobs that perhaps they didn't have certainly 70 years ago and maybe even 50 years ago. In fact, a sociologist who picks up on this is someone called Sue Sharp, and she ran 2 studies, one in the 1970s and one in the 1990s. And basically what she did was she went out and asked like teenage girls, what do you want to do later in life? Like, what's your ambitions? What's your aspirations? And in the 1970s, what these girls said basically was their ambitions were to get married, have kids and settle down. And in the 1990s, she asked kids the same thing, and they said, no, I want to go out and get a job, I want to spend some money, and then maybe I want to get married and settle down. So what we can see from Sharp's research is that girls have had a greater level of aspirations over time. We can also look at the role of legal. We can also look at the role of laws and policies that have helped, particularly that changing role of women in society. So thinking about things like the 1970 Equal Pay Act or the 2010 Equality Act, or even the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, all of these things encouraging women to go out and work and get a fairer deal than perhaps they might have got beforehand. Last couple of things to say. Feminism itself has undoubtedly played undoubtedly played a role in raising women's aspirations and making us as a population, as a society, more conscious of the gender bias that might exist in our society. So we've got things like now where people are actively hoping to, excuse me, I've got a runny nose, where people are actively hoping to employ women for certain jobs. So in things like science, technology, engineering and maths, there's been a massive push in those kind of industries recently to get girls into those kind of subjects and those kind of jobs. And the last thing I'm going to say as well is something that's more to do with associating with why boys are underachieving rather than girls overachieving or just achieving, is this concept of a crisis of masculinity. And what a crisis of masculinity is, it's the idea that men or boys don't know what our role in society is anymore. Because again, we're thinking here about going back 50 years, men knew what was what. Basically, we had the instrumental role, we were the boss, we wore the trousers, you know, we dominated families, we had our way very easily. But the argument is that since deindustrialization, which is where they got rid of all the factories and all the manufacturing and stuff, men haven't really had a place to work. We haven't like had a place that we can call our own. And so lots of us, indeed all of us basically, are now working in the service sector economy, working on computers and things like that. Whereas my dad and my grandfather, certainly my grandfather, was a miner, you know, and these kind of jobs just don't exist anymore. So men just don't know what we're supposed to do. In addition to that, we've had these other ideas of like feminization of education, girls clearly overtaking boys in GCSEs and all of those kind of things. And so men have just kind of lost their mojo a little bit, and we don't really know what the point of us is anymore. And that is often used as an argument to explain why there are such a higher rate of suicides amongst men than there are amongst women, because there's this crisis of masculinity. It's certainly something we associate with the last sort of 30 years of British society. So let's just bring this all together and let's have a look at some of the theory links we can make here. So obviously feminism is the theory that we're going to be talking about if we're talking about gender differences. And as I mentioned when I went through the theories of education a couple of videos ago, feminists see the role of education as mirroring patriarchy in society. So, for instance, we're thinking about like school hierarchies where you might have most teachers as female, but almost certainly the top people are going to be men. We can also consider the ways in which, like Becky Francis argues, that boys dominate space in schools and teacher attention, and this just reflects how men are in society, dominating society. And the other thing we can also say as well is that feminism itself has played a role in encouraging girls and giving them something to aspire to, because they know it's actually a possibility now. So there's a whole host of reasons there why girls might do better than boys. But fundamentally, throughout all of this, what we've done is we've looked at the role of internal, i.e. in school, and external, i.e. at home factors, and that can help explain basically why all of these different types of social groups, there are such differences between exam results and school achievement. So just to recap, when we looked at class, we basically argued that middle class kids do better than working class kids, and that's due to a whole range of internal and external factors. When we think about the external, we're thinking about stuff outside of school, and we split that between cultural, which are like ideas and values, and material, which are things like we can touch and things that we can buy with money. When we looked at ethnicity, we looked at similar sorts of reasons, again considering the impact of internal and external factors. When it came to internal, I brought in a new couple of ideas for you, in particular the role of racism and institutional racism and the ethnocentric curriculum. So ethnocentric curriculum meaning only focuses on one ethnic background. And then finally, what we also looked at was the role that we can see gender playing in between girls outperforming boys at GCSEs. And again, we looked at the role of internal and external factors there, particularly focusing on the changing role of women, the changing role of work, and potentially looking at the reason why boys underachieve by explaining that through the crisis of masculinity. So there we go. That's me done. That's me back again. And this was the final video on education. So the last one I'm going to do, which is going to be the next video you watch, me number 10, is going to be all about research methods. And I'm going to try and squeeze a little exam question in that one as well for you. So once again, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you found it helpful. If you have, you know what to do by now. Give me a like, give me a subscribe, share, tell your mates about it. Go and, I don't know, drop me an email or whatever, say thank you. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? If you want to, go and check us out on the All Sociology Take One podcast. So just search All Sociology on Spotify, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcast from. Go and give it a listen, because there's bits and pieces in there that you hopefully will find helpful too. And other than that, I'm now going to shut up and I'm going to go. And then very shortly, you'll be having the last and the 10th video of this GCSE Paper 1 revision video session. All right. Thanks again for your time. I will see you all later. Take care. Bye.